In 2008, we presented the Citizen of the Year Award to Ray Judah. Ray Judah, former county commissioner and presently coordinator for the Florida Coastal and Ocean Coalition, is a widely known and long-time advocate for the responsible stewardship of Florida waters. In the nearly 20 years that Ray served, I think it's more like 24 years, wasn't it, that Ray served as commissioner, he always took a particular interest in environmental issues. He has a strong background in environmental science with a bachelor's degree in zoology and a master's in natural resources from California State University at Humboldt. Before becoming a commissioner, he had worked as a biologist, marine biologist, land use planner, and environmental specialist. He has chaired the 10-county Coalition for Responsible Management of Lake Okeechobee and was a co-founder of the Corkscrew Regional Ecosystem Watershed Land Trust. He led the effort to create the Conservation 2020 initiative to purchase environmentally sensitive land in the county. He has not hesitated to take on special interest groups such as Big Sugar and phosphate mines. And we're pleased that he's here today to talk to us about Everglades and coastal estuaries restoration by the numbers. Ray? Give him just a moment. This technology does take a moment or two.
I'm just climbing out of the ice age. I'm somewhat of a Neanderthal with technology, so thank you for your patience, and I appreciate Yvonne and Barbara's help and Tom taking care of matters. Good morning. Good morning. It's great to be here, and let me first of all thank Barbara for the invitation to have this forum within which I can provide and share some comments I think you'll be interested in with regards to the mismanagement of the Lake Okeechobee watershed. But first of all, let me congratulate Rayanne Wessel. My gosh, I've known Rayanne for the 30 years that she has worked so diligently as the ambassador for Southwest Florida, not just the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation. As Barbara mentioned, she's had a long history of championing and working on behalf of our land and water resources, and a recognition well-deserved. Congratulations, Rayanne. Also, let me acknowledge City Councilman Mick Denham. I've had a chance to work with Mick over the years, and he truly has been a catalyst in moving forward on so many issues with regards to conversion of septic tanks to central sewer, a lot of water quality issues, and he continues to work on your behalf here, not only on Sanibel, but actually throughout the region. And Mick, it's good to see you here today. I wanted to ask you first whether or not you wanted the light and fluffy version or the brutal truth with this PowerPoint. Well, I was kind of hoping you'd say that because I left the light and fluffy version at home. And I wanted to also just ask you if you remember, I think it was a movie, A Few Good Men, with Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson. And you remember when Tom Cruise, the attorney, was questioning Nicholson. He was a witness on the stand at the time, and Tom Cruise said, "I want the truth," and Nicholson fired back, "You can't handle the truth." I know that you can handle the truth because you are going to get that today in spades. This has been a brutal number of decades with the mismanagement of our Lake Okeechobee watershed. And I keep this first slide up here to start off my power presentation just as a reminder to my wonderful friends with the sugar industry. The sugar industry managed to contribute more than $325,000 along with the fertilizer industry and some of their best friends for a total of over $750,000 in a blistering negative propaganda campaign back in 2012 to oust me from office. They perhaps thought that they had gotten rid of me, but as a county commissioner, I worked part-time on trying to protect the environment because I was responsible for transportation issues, human service issues, libraries, parks, etc. Now, as the coordinator for the Florida Coastal and Ocean Coalition, I like to send a message to the sugar industry and all the other polluters that have affected our environment in such dramatic ways that I now work full-time on behalf of the environment. So saddle up, get comfortable, because here we go. And again, for the reason on this slide, I want this indelibly imprinted on your mind, because when you think of the red tide, the fish kills, the algae blooms, the red drift algae on our beaches even today, I want you to think of this particular and visualize this image. It's an outfall pipe on a sugarcane field. You can see the sugarcane in the background there. Discharging into a canal. There's a series of canals in what's called the Everglades agricultural area, which actually end up back pumping all this water back into Lake Okeechobee. And from there, of course, it comes down the Caloosahatchee on the west coast, the St. Lucie on the east coast, adversely impacting our estuaries. And so I also leave this up here because we really are just in an untenable situation. You have public officials like Commissioner Frank Mann, who says that last summer, the discoloration of the water was because of the tannins that are released, the organic compounds that are released from our mangrove bark and leaves that are discoloring the water. Well, for those of you who've been here for a while, you recognize that, yes, tannins are released, in fact, in the summer, in the wet, rainy season, but it's a tea color. It's a light tea color to the water. What we see now are stanky, putrid, coffee ground color of the Caloosahatchee and our coastal estuaries. And I would have to submit to Commissioner Mann, he needs to get better educated, like many of our elected officials, that it is not tannins that is causing the problem with the discoloration of our water. It is the discharge from the sugarcane fields to the south of the lake that back pump into the lake, and also the dairy farms north of the lake, with all the chemical waste, including pesticides, fertilizers, insecticides, and all the heavy nutrients, primarily composed of nitrogen and phosphorus, that act as a catalyst that creates these problems downstream. Then you also receive from the media that red tide, when we are experiencing red tide, that it's a natural phenomenon, that it emanates from offshore. What they don't go into any detail is that once that red tide comes in, whether it's wind action or the currents, into the nearshore area with all the nutrients in the water from the nitrogen and phosphorus, that is the catalyst that increases the frequency and duration of red tide, that is just causing such problems, not only for all of us residents in terms of water quality and the quality of life, but certainly for the tourists that we rely on. A $65 billion tourism industry statewide, $3 billion right here in Lee County. That's our bread and butter, and here we are adversely impacting the very waterways that are so important for driving our tourism economy. So if I could please have the next slide. Many of you probably are familiar with the whole Lake Okeechobee water regime. Some of you may not, and I think it's always a good idea just to point out that this Lake Okeechobee watershed is a huge watershed. In fact, what you see in red up there is Orlando. And of course, you can see the lake. I don't have a pointer, but I think it's pretty evident where the lake is. And the red depicting Orlando, and I'm sure you've probably heard that there's a little creek called Shingle Creek that's right there near Disney World, and there's many other creeks and tributaries that enter into the Kissimmee River, ultimately flowing into Lake Okeechobee. But the very upper reaches of the watershed starts in Orlando. And then, of course, once that water from the Kissimmee River and also rainfall get into the lake, it then disperses to the west, east, and to the south. I think this next photograph, though, or slide, will help to allow you to visualize. And you can see there the chain of lakes, where Lake Kissimmee, and then the Kissimmee River connecting to Lake Okeechobee, the Caloosahatchee, of course, to Fort Myers, the St. Lucie over to the Indian River Lagoon on the east coast. And then, of course, what you see there, maybe you're not so familiar with it, but the letters EAA, Everglades Agricultural Area, about 700,000 acres, primarily sugarcane. About 440,000 acres of that 700,000 acres is sugarcane. The rest is row crop, but sugarcane clearly is the predominant crop in the Everglades agricultural area. You'll see the water conservation areas that are publicly owned, a vast amount of land that helps to store and treat much of the water that ultimately flows to the south, and then, of course, Everglades National Park. So I think once you get a chance to visualize on the map what I'll be talking about today, we'll all have a better understanding of the challenges and solutions to properly managing the Lake Okeechobee watershed. If I could have the next slide, please. Okay, you've probably seen this before. It depicts the historic flowway, and as many of you already, again, are probably familiar with is that back in the 1800s, the state of Florida was flat broke, and a Philadelphia businessman by the name of Hamilton Diston offered up a proposal to the state of Florida at 25 cents an acre, bought about $4 million worth of land, wanted to enhance commerce, actually connected the Caloosahatchee River to Lake Okeechobee. It was never naturally connected initially. And then in the late 1920s, the St. Lucie River Canal was connected to the East Coast. But before those connections were made, water, of course, filled up the lake during the summer wet rainy season, overflowed the banks, and flowed to the south into Everglades National Park, prior to the park being established, but into that Everglades area and then into Florida Bay. And so you can see pretty much the pattern of where that sheet flow used to flow to. You look at the, you look at the middle slide there and you see what's happened. The larger arrows now depicting the amount of water going to the west and to the east. The smaller arrows actually part of the Central South Florida Water Drainage District that was established back in the 1940s. Those canals were constructed at that point in time to help drain the Everglades, to help drain the lake. And a certain amount of that water is conveyed down those canals over to the Atlantic Ocean. Interestingly enough, and the reason I keep this slide, the slide on the far right, the photograph on the far right there, or the drawing, is interesting from the standpoint that on the East Coast, the folks on the East Coast don't want any more water from Lake Okeechobee. They feel they get enough water from the watershed, and that the excess amount of water from the lake with all the chemical waste and the nutrients are causing and ravaging and destroying what really had been a pristine, one of the most ecologically, biologically productive systems in the world, the Indian River Lagoon. And that's not the case anymore. It has really been hit hard by discharges from the lake. So the folks on the East Coast don't want any flow from the lake. However, and this is another cause for concern with people's understanding of what's going on in the Lake Okeechobee watershed, we do need minimum flows. At times, if we get those excessive massive releases from the lake, we all know the harm that it creates to our coastal estuaries. But also, if we don't get minimum flows, we have just as dramatic a problem in our ecosystem, and we'll get into that in just a second. But the reason I kept the slide is people need to know that, no, we don't want to stop flows, particularly minimum flows, during the dry time of year here to the west coast, to our coastal back bays and estuaries. You see the name there, Plan 6, that's one of the iterations of a proposal that we'll talk about briefly concerning the ultimate solution to addressing the problem with massive releases from the lake, and that's providing a flowway in the Everglades agricultural area to reestablish what Mother Nature had provided for initially, and that's to convey the water from the lake to the Everglades. Next slide, please. Is it not? Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry.
There we go.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you, Tom. With the minimum flows exceedance, meaning that we don't receive that we need for environmental release from the lake, we end up having all sorts of problems. One of them being that you get a buildup of blue-green algae because you don't have the flows that help to flush the river down towards the coastal back bays and estuaries. And this is just above the Franklin Locks. There's 3 locks on the Caloosahatchee River, Moorhaven right there at the lake, and then the Ortona Lock, and then the Franklin Locks. This is a pretty putrid, but unfortunately all too prevalent scene that we have during the dry time of year when we don't get environmental releases from the South Florida Water Management District. You have this blue-green algae, which actually is toxic to fish, wildlife, and humans. And ultimately what we have over the years is received public health warnings from the Public Health Department posting signs for people not to come into contact with this water. An additional problem is that Lee County has a water treatment plant in that vicinity, and because of the discoloration of the water, because of the impact to taste, to odor, the Lee County Utilities is not able to use that facility and ends up having to shut it down at a cost to all of us as taxpayers, because they have to work out an agreement either with Cape Coral or one of the other utilities to be able to provide sufficient water to accommodate the customer base that otherwise would have been provided for water from the water utility here And so it is a dramatic economic impact, again, when we don't have those minimum releases. And another, of course, problem is that you get hypersaline conditions. So much so that you actually get boring sponges and other mollusks and gastropods that end up destroying the oyster beds. You also have a situation where literally hundreds of acres of freshwater grass, Vallisneria, the tape grass, is destroyed because of the amount of salinity that's in the water that they can't survive in. And with the loss of the freshwater tape grass, you're impacting food and habitat for a lot of our important marine fish and shellfish, whether it's shrimp, crabs, redfish, snook, snapper, trout. So it has a dramatic impact when it is too saline. And we are constantly fighting with the South Florida Water Management District to at least provide minimum releases during the dry time of year, as opposed to retaining all that water in the lake solely so that the sugarcane industry has water available for irrigation during the dry time of year. We're always pleading for at least some environmental release, and I just want to give you one example of the problems that we do have when we don't get those minimum flows. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a depiction of, obviously, of the lake with a lot of numbers up there, and you're going to need to understand it's not real difficult. Cubic feet per second, the CFS, is just a unit of measurement for a flow rate, and then you have the acre feet unit of measurement. Basically, an acre foot, if you take an acre and you stack water a foot high, that's 1 acre foot of water. And it's important that you understand these numbers, because this is what the policymakers and the South Florida Water Management District do not want you to know or to understand. We're going to go over this, and believe me, it's readily understandable. But it's important to point out that the Audubon of Florida, a number of years ago, really did us a service by analyzing the water budget in the Lake Okeechobee watershed. And during an average year, they came up with 4.7 million acre feet of water that actually, through rainfall and through flow from the Kissimmee River into the lake, provide about 4.7 million acre feet of water. Well, 2.4 million acre feet or 2.5 million acre feet of that evaporates. So that leaves roughly 2.2, 2.3 million acre feet of water in the lake on an average year. Keep in mind, as you look at these numbers, 44% of it going down the Caloosahatchee at 9,300 cubic feet per second, roughly a million acre feet. You look over there on the St. Lucie estuary in the 442,000 acre feet per year going to the East Coast. And then down to the south, you see the roughly 500,000 acre, 508,000 acres that goes to agriculture, and then another 287,000 acre feet that go to the Everglades. So the point is that a predominant amount of that water that is in the lake on an average year is shifted to the West Coast and to the East Coast, and the Everglades is starving of water. The Corps of Engineers, by the way, and there's been a lot of politicians that have blasted the Corps of Engineers for how dare they release all that excessive water during the wet, rainy months down the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie, destroying our estuaries, go so far as to say that the Corps is responsible for the problems. And my question to those policymakers is, what would you expect the Corps to do? Stack more water in the lake and not release the water when those are the relief valves that they have to rely on to protect public safety and property? The Corps can't continue to allow water levels to rise in the lake at such a height that they're going to compromise the integrity of the Herbert Hoover Dike. The Herbert Hoover Dike, of course, was built because of damage to property and to people's lives back in the 30s. The federal government decided they better build this dike around the lake in order to prevent loss of property and lives. But it was made out of peat and organic substrate and very poorly made muck. And so today they are now in the process of actually fortifying and strengthening the Herbert Hoover Dike. They've spent about $750 million already for, I think, about 12 miles. They have another 122 miles to go. They're now rethinking perhaps there's another way to protect the integrity of the dike. But suffice to say that their concern is if the water level gets to such a height, it'll cause that breach and the break in the dike and affect people's lives and property. So the Corps is not to be blamed. They have no choice but to have to release the water down the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie. Who's to blame is the government officials that haven't pushed for a spillway, which is built on just about every reservoir and dam in America to provide for the necessary relief, excuse me, the necessary relief for releasing that water so as to reduce the overall pressure and impact on the integrity of the Herbert Hoover Dike. I have water right there. I apologize. Thank you. Sorry for the frog in my throat. And so really what needs to be done is, and we'll get into that in just a second, is a spillway needs to be built. The Corps of Engineers is doing a risk assessment in 2015 as to the need for a spillway. I would say it's long past due. They're going to find that indeed a spillway is needed to alleviate the pressure on the dike and allow the water to flow to the south where it needs to flow. There's going to be a lot of opposition, of course, primarily from the sugar industry that does not want the water flowing from the lake to the south and certainly does not want a flowway in the Everglades agricultural area. Nonetheless, I think the Corps of Engineers is going to find it economically that they just can't continue to pay this exorbitant amount of money and continue to fortify that dike to the extent that they initially had anticipated. So we'll see what happens once that risk assessment report comes out in 2015. But I did want to point out to you that you've already heard that with the Water Resource Development Act, that there's going to be money that's going to be allocated for the construction of the C-43 reservoir, which is over here on the west coast. There is already construction of the C-44 reservoir on the east coast. Now keep in mind the C-43 reservoir, it's about going to be some kind of monument to mankind built up about 22 feet high above the ground, absolutely no ecological value whatsoever. It's strictly going to be able to contain water. But what you have to keep in mind, and this is where it really gets interesting, that 9,300 cubic feet per second that you see, the water that's released right there at the Moorhaven Locks into the Clusatchee River, that equates to about 6 billion gallons a year. Well, the C-43 reservoir is going to be 170,000 acre-feet of storage, which equates to about 55 billion gallons. And it's quick math, you can determine how quickly is C-43 going to fill up at 6 billion gallons a day. We're going to spend, all told, after purchase of land, construction of the reservoir, and then I'm sure there's going to have to be remediated work regarding the seepage problem that they're going to have in the C-43 reservoir, literally over $1 billion+. And so here we have this reservoir that's going to end up storing water and filling up within 9 days. And we had 7,400 cubic feet per second on average for 4 months last summer, just like the excessive amount of rains that we received back in 2005. And we're getting into a wet, rainier cycle. That 2.21 million acre feet of water, where 1.4 million acre feet went to the west and east coast, actually this past year in 2013 was more around 2.1 to 2.5 million acre feet of water. We're talking about 800 billion gallons of water, and it's just a colossal waste of fresh water supply to a state that's going to be the third largest state in the not too distant future. So when I say mismanagement, it's at a colossal proportion. The East Coast, of course, at the 400,000 acre feet a year, roughly 442,000 acre feet a year into the St. Lucie. As I mentioned, there's a C-44 reservoir that's being built. That one at least has a water quality component. C-43 is not even going to be built with a water quality component. So what we're going to have is basically a incubator for blue-green algae, because you're going to get the nutrients, the nitrogen and phosphorus, you're going to have warm water, and you're not going to have any circulation. And all that is going to do is be an incubator for more blue-green algae that's going to be re-released back into the lake. Ostensibly, the water being stored in C-43 with some so-called detention time is going to supposedly filter the water. It won't. And in fact, it's going to be more of a problem. There are those that say that we need it for helping to meet minimum flows. I would submit that it's probably going to end up being used for agriculture. In C-44 on the East Coast, in fact, the water from the lake is not even going to go into C-44. Actually, the water in C-44 is from drainage from the agricultural lands surrounding the C-44 site. So when you hear stories about the Water Resource Development Act that's going to be the savior with the construction of C-43, you now know in proper perspective it will have no relief for the massive releases of water from Lake Okeechobee. None. 9 days is not going to cover it. If we could have, the red dots that you see around the northern rim of the Lake Okeechobee, they actually depict aquifer storage recovery wells. They are actually constructed there. They just depict where the South Florida Water Management District wanted to initially construct the aquifer storage recovery wells, because that was the rabbit hole that they were running down, thinking that would be the answer to storing all that excess water that's being discharged to the west and east coast of Florida. Those aquifer storage recovery wells are about $6 to $8 million a well. Then you have the exorbitant maintenance costs to operate those wells, and then on top of that, this is an effort to try to capture excessive water and then deep well it into the underground aquifer, supposedly to build up a freshwater lens or reservoir where you can recapture the water at some point in time for potable water or for irrigation. But unfortunately, the geologic strata is such, and the marine tests have already shown this to be true, that they can't have the comfort level, the certainty they're going to be able to recover as much water as they are injecting down into the aquifers. Secondly, when you deep well water at the pressure they're expecting, you end up causing the release of arsenic. So this is not something that is turning out to be a viable solution for the South Florida Water Management District. If you could go to the next slide, please. Okay, this is not Photoshop. You're all probably familiar with this scene. This is all the heavy sediment and runoff from the Caloosahatchee getting into San Carlos Bay and around Sanibel. Not a desirable way in which to attract tourists from all over the world, or to even maintain real estate values and provide for the quality of life that people expect living here in Lee County. But this is obviously one of the major problems when you get the excessive releases. The next slide, please. Obviously, this is an older photo, probably about 8 to 10 years ago. All the different types of algae that gets into the river and into Pine Island Sound, around the docks of those living on the water. Next slide, please. I believe this is Jensen Marina. And again, slides taken a number of years ago. And I really want to thank Rand Wessel, and I've got another slide here I'm going to show you in just a second, but the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation has provided a lot of these wonderful slides over the years, and I just want to give credit to them. This may have been something that was provided to Pure a few years ago, but it does obviously show the dead seagrass and also the dead fish, and obviously the concern with the smell here at this marina. If you could go to the next slide. Oop.
There's no next slide. You brought it up. Slide this. Let me go to the next. Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Just scroll it up. Thank you.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. We're in this together. Just another example of folks having to take care of the difficulty of living downstream when you have people upstream that aren't responsible with how they treat the Caloosahatchee and our back bays and estuaries. Next slide, please. This you've seen this and certainly read reports. Red drift algae, again, about 8 to 10 years ago, I think the slide. As thick as that red drift algae is, obviously had to be hauled off and taken off the beach. I know that Sanibel prides itself on not raking the beach, and I applaud you all for that, but obviously when you get to this kind of situation, you have to haul off this red drift algae. But next slide, please. To bring us current, I just took this photograph a couple of weeks ago. This is on Bunch Beach. So here we go again. And people see this red drift algae at this time of year, and they're wondering and shaking their heads, what the heck? We're not even getting any discharges. Well, the nutrients obviously stay in the water. We don't have the Gulf Stream here. Water doesn't circulate as well as we'd like it to. And this is what you have. You have all the nutrients in the water that feed the algae. The algae dies and gets washed up on the shore and creates problems with disruption to natural habitat. Next slide, please. And this is the one that says it all. And again, I want to thank Rand and the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, because this was taken, Rand can confirm, but it was either August or July of last year. And so during the time we had just, monsoon rainy season. And it's interesting to note that you see Lake Okeechobee, of course, the teal color, turquoise color, and you see the Caloosahatchee, and of course over to the west, Sanibel and Pine Island. And then as you look south of Lake Okeechobee, you'll see that area. Remember again what we called it, the Everglades Agricultural Area, and the canals that run through there. And then, of course, south of that is the Water Conservation Area and the Everglades. Well, here we go. This is not even a water resource policy or a law, but I can assure you, I consider it the 11th commandment for the South Florida Water Management District. And by the way, for those of you probably maybe not familiar with the way in which things work out, the governor makes appointments to the South Florida Water Management District Governing Board, 9-member governing board, and they're the ones we entrust to manage our water resources and manage the lake. Typically, of course, you're going to have somebody that reflects the mindset of the governor. We've had a vice president of U.S. Sugar on the governing board. Right now, we have a representative of our West Coast that works for King Ranch. So mostly you have folks that I would say very politely, perhaps more interested in the special interest corporations and businesses that they represent, sitting on that governing board in which they are supposed to represent the public interest. And so here we have, as you see, monsoon rainy season in 2013, middle of the summer, and the EAA is dry, and everything else is saturated. And by the way, the Everglades and the water conservation area aren't saturated, as you see on this slide, because of water from the lake. That's just from heavy rainfall. Typically, as I said, the Everglades is starved of water. It doesn't get what it needs from Lake Okeechobee. But the 11th commandment I was speaking of, it is, I could pretty well quote it by suggesting that the South Florida Water Management District maintains the water level 18 to 24 inches below ground in the Everglades agricultural area to provide optimum growing conditions for the sugarcane, regardless of the seasonal fluctuations of the year we're speaking of. So if there's too much water, because the sugarcane industry can't meet the federal consent decree of 10 parts per billion for phosphorus, they can't send the water south. So they send it north. They send it back into the lake. That's the back pumping I'm talking about. Because people are wondering, how the heck can the sugarcane industry south of the lake affect Lake Okeechobee? Because they back pump into the lake. And that's precisely what happens and how all the chemical waste and the nutrients get into that lake and, of course, come down the Clusatch and affect our back bays and estuaries. So, again, by the edict by the South Florida Water Management District to always take care of providing for optimum growing conditions in the EAA, all that water gets shunted to the west and to the east, affecting our estuaries. Next slide, please. Okay, I talked about a flowway in the Everglades agricultural area. This helps to depict where that flowway would be constructed. The slide on the right does not indicate necessarily the size of the flowway, because and by the way, we're not talking about, with the creation of a flowway, destroying buildings and causing people to have to be relocated. We're talking about fields, agricultural fields, primarily sugarcane fields. And what we're referring to when we say purchasing land to create the flowway in the Everglades agricultural area is approximately 50,000 acres. You see the public lands existing there. That's about 62,000 acres. If we were able to acquire another 50,000 acres, and by the way, 20,000 would come from U.S. Sugar, 30,000 would come from Florida Crystal, another large sugar conglomerate in the Everglades agricultural area, we could then have sufficient land in excess of 100,000 acres to design a dynamic storage, treatment, and conveyance to the south and alleviate the Corps' responsibility of trying to protect the integrity of the dike by having to discharge the water to the west and east and actually discharge the water to the south where it needs to go. The sugarcane industry disseminates a lot of erroneous information that what we on the West Coast want to do is to destroy the agricultural industry and the sugarcane industry's way of living and work. That's not the case. The 50,000 acres I spoke of constitute 7% of the entire Everglades agricultural area. Because remember I said that's 700,000 acres. It constitutes 15% of all the sugarcane fields. And so I don't think that's something that's not doable when you consider it would still allow for agriculture to thrive and to profit, but it would give all of us in the state of Florida, primarily those in South Florida, an opportunity to have a real solution to properly store, treat, and convey that water from the lake to the Everglades. And that's what we're really needing to push for. And, unfortunately, Governor Scott put an end to the momentum that was started by then Governor Charlie Crist when he actually worked out an agreement with U.S. Sugar to buy initially 187,000 acres, the entire U.S. Sugar land holdings and all their assets. The economy started to falter. That eventually was reduced substantially to about 76,000 acres, and ultimately, before Charlie Crist left his administration, the state purchased 26,000 acres. And most of that land is located over to the east by the Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge, so it doesn't help us with the flowway. Unfortunately, Governor Scott campaigned against any more purchase of land in the Everglades agricultural area, and he and the legislature failed. Last October was the deadline that was agreed upon, where the state could have bought the balance of 153,000 acres for the total of 187,000 in order to provide for not only land that would be purchased from U.S. Sugar for part of this flowway, but to have enough land to do a land exchange with Florida Crystal so that we could actually have a comprehensive, contiguous tract of land to create this flowway. Florida Crystals is not the easiest organization or business to try to negotiate with. They would never take a one-for-one exchange, so you have to have extra land for that necessary land exchange in order to, again, put together the comprehensive tract of land needed for the flowway. Unfortunately, the governor and the legislature let that deadline pass, and so now the state is in a situation where eventually they're going to come to the realization that we do need more land south of the lake to create this flowway, but it's going to cost us a whole lot more than the $7,400 an acre that was agreed upon in the Charlie Crist administration. In fact, now we're going to have to compete with others that might want to buy that land for other purposes. And then, of course, there's the Farm Bill that artificially inflates the value of that land that all of us taxpayers are dearly affected by. Next slide, please. So this again shows the kind of the stair-step process, water from the lake with the red arrows going down into the land that's going to be eventually developed as a flow equalization basin with some filtration, then extending down into the water conservation area. You see the Miami Canal on the far left of the series of canals that are in that Central Everglades drainage system. That's part of the Everglades agriculture, and the North New River Canal. So that flowway would be between those two canals. And again, only 50,000 acres is what is needed to combine with the current publicly owned lands. If you could go to the next slide, please. The governor last year was suggesting that with his proposed joint agreement with the Department of Interior, where the state was going to kick in $90 million and the federal government, the Department of Interior, was going to kick in $90 million to build a couple of 2.6 miles of bridging on the Tamiami Trail, was going to address our concern with the massive releases from Lake Okeechobee, was disingenuous. And if you look at the numbers, you can understand why. First of all, it's important that we have the bridging on the Tamiami Trail because it's acted as a dam for decades, and we do need to provide for water to flow into the Everglades National Park. And so it's a good thing that the money hopefully will be allocated for the 2.6 miles of bridging that will complement the existing 1-mile bridge that's down there on the Tamiami Trail. What it doesn't do is alleviate the massive releases from Lake Okeechobee. And all you have to do is look at what's called the Central Everglades Planning Project, which is about a $2.6 billion proposed project that, by the way, is not in the Water Resource Development Act, which includes the bridging of the Tamiami Trail, although the state and the Interior is going to help expedite the funding for that project. But also, you can see it's a levee there between Water Conservation Area 3A and 3B that's kind of at an angle. There's going to be an attempt through the Central Everglades Planning Project to open up that levee to allow water to flow from the Water Conservation Area 3A to 3B, which is critical. The white area that you see to the east is development that should never have been allowed to begin with, because obviously they're concerned about any flooding, and so the government's going to have to figure out, okay, if they break down that levee and provide for water flow, which is where it should go, they're going to have to put some kind of seepage barrier to make sure they don't flood the very development that they permitted that they shouldn't have. But if you talk to the Corps of Engineers and you look at the numbers, they will tell you that with the Central Everglades Planning Project, only 210,000 acre-feet of water will go from the lake to and through and under the bridging. That's 68 billion gallons of water. That's what I said, 210,000 acre-feet of water. And this past rainy season, we had 2.1 to 2.5 million acre-feet of water. So I called it the 10% solution. The governor wasn't real happy with that, but that's exactly what it is. It's just a little, not even a significant relief to the massive releases from Lake Okeechobee. Next slide, please. So this is just it's not even to scale, but it's a way to hopefully have people remember where we say the missing link, or Plan 6 is the fix, but it doesn't have to be Plan 6. It can be an iteration of Plan 6, but we need a flowway. That gray area is the Everglades agriculture area, to once and for all alleviate the massive releases that we're getting destroyed by here on the west and, of course, over on the east coast. Next slide, please. Here's where things really get insidious, and I'll try to go over these as quickly as I can. The Farm Bill. This is unbelievable. This is worse than the oil cartel monopoly. Here we have the U.S. government propping up. It's through a protectionist scheme. The sugar industry will tell you they don't get subsidized. Well, they don't get dollars handed over to them, so it's not, I guess, a direct subsidy. But here's how it works. The United States Department of Agriculture actually provides loans to the sugar industry. And, of course, in order to back those loans, they put sugar up as collateral. Well, the government, through price support at 18.5 cents a pound, makes sure that the sugar industry profits from their operation, and in so doing, with tariffs and import quotas, prevent any competition from anyone else in the world, any other countries in the world. And so it's not surprising that you find those that rely on sugar to bring their products to market, the confectionaires or the bottling industry, either go to Canada or go to other parts of the world where they can obtain sugar at a less costly price. And if you think this doesn't affect you individually, think about all the sugar that's in the items you purchase at the grocery store, whether it's cereal or bread, ketchup, whatever, artificially increasing the price of sugar in all that we eat. So again, it's not a direct subsidy, but it sure is a, I would say, direct contradiction to the free market economy, wherein which with the price support, the tariffs, and the import quotas, the sugar industry can not only be guaranteed profits, but they can roll those profits into contributing to state legislators, to unearth or undermine local governments, and contributing to congressional policymakers in order to make sure that this particular bill is not affected in any way. The government just recently approved of the Farm Bill, and interesting enough, what few changes they made did not translate to any reform on the sugar industry's benefits. That 18.5 cents a pound translates to a couple $2 billion a year because of that price support. Next question. Next slide, please. The 1996 Polluters Pay Constitutional Amendment, for those of you who have been here this long, you probably voted and supported it. This is amazing to me. It was a constitutional amendment wherein which, through the will of the people, stipulated that the polluters in the Everglades agricultural area and in the Everglades protection area, which includes the water conservation area, were primarily responsible for having to clean up their pollution. Well, it was legally challenged when it was first approved by the voters back in 1996. It went to the state Supreme Court, and the state Supreme Court said, well, it's not self-executing. So you, the legislature, are going to have to implement the Polluters Pay Constitutional Amendment. And here we are going into our 18th year, and the legislature has yet to fulfill and implement the will of the people, that it's the polluters that should have to pay, not the taxpayers. Next slide, please. Okay, the 1994 Everglades Forever Act was ostensibly to try to get the polluters to have to pay for the cleanup of their pollution, and they actually incorporated a privilege fee to pollute, and the privilege fee amounted to $25 an acre, but there was a cap that was placed on that act, $320 million. So after the sugar industry paying $25 an acre, eventually exhausted or approached the cap of $320 million, that commitment was to go away. And it's to go away, I think, in 2017. Here's what happened. Representative Matt Caldwell, who's very closely aligned to the sugar industry, did something that, unless you read between the lines, you don't really appreciate what strategy went into effect. Caldwell sponsored an amendment to the Everglades Forever Act, and even the media carried it in such a way that people thought, what a great Everglades champion. he is going to force the sugar industry to extend their $25. Do I need to stop? Excuse me. Thank you. So Representative Caldwell sponsored an amendment last session, 2013, to the Everglades Forever Act, extending the $25 an acre to 2026. And people read and hear the action, they think, oh, that's wonderful. Sugar's going to continue to pay to help clean up the pollution. But then when you look at the numbers, there's 440,000 acres in the Everglades agricultural area at $25 an acre. That amounts to $11 million a year. You think that's a lot of money? Put it in perspective, the figures now for restoring the Everglades is $16 billion over the next 30 years. To me, and to any legal scholar or any attorney, I would think they would scratch their head and think, you know what? Looks like this was an effort to cap or limit the liability to the sugar industry with regards to how they have to and what they should pay to clean up the pollution at $25 an acre. So we have the polluter's pay provision, which is really something that should be enacted by the legislature and imposed on the sugar industry, in which, in fact, the sugar industry would pay their proportionate share. And I could see where the legal defense for the sugar industry would be, oh, wait a minute, we're already on the hook for $25 an acre till 2026, pursuant to the amendments to the Everglades Forever Act. What a deal for the sugar industry. So I just trying to put that in perspective. Whoop, I think we went ahead too far. We just got to go back. Okay, and the next slide, I think, is and then the next one. Okay, and then you have the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule. I'd mentioned to you that the Corps of Engineers is fortifying the Herbert Hoover Dike. The greatest concern right now is that with the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule, which was adopted back in 2008, it's really an adaptive protocol process for managing the lake level. And also having water management bans that the Corps works through with the South Florida Water Management District on water releases to either industry, utilities, agriculture, some environmental release. It actually was supported by the Corps of Engineers to give them time to alleviate the pressure on the Herbert Hoover Dike. And so the water level, where it used to be managed from 13.5 to 15.5, was dropped a foot down to 12.5. Well, there's a side benefit to the environment. There's more storage for more water to be stored in the lake at a lower level, and it turned out that this was a Corps decision that was beneficial to the environment. Now, though, with the fortification of the Herbert Hoover Dike, there are those that feel, okay, we can now go back to stacking water at a much higher depth. In doing so, you run the risk of having too much water once again, and then when you get the rainy season coming in, the Corps has got a discharge down the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie, blowing out our estuaries. And also, when you stack water at higher level in the lake, you destroy the very wetlands that rim the lake that are so important for food and habitat for fish and wildlife. So that's a battle that is brewing, that we'd like to keep the regulation schedule at the 12.5 to 15.5 for optimum lake level management conditions. Next slide. And then you have the Water Resource Development and Reform Act, and I actually already spoke that don't think that this is the panacea. Again, 170,000 acre-foot of storage, 55 billion gallons of water in the C-43, good to store enough water for 9 days, and then what? Well, bypass the C-43, and we'll continue to see our estuaries blown out. So that's it, and I tried to summarize as best I can, and if you have questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. By the way, before I do finish up, people have asked me what can they do? And I have suggested to them join organizations like Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, CODI, Conservancy of Southwest Florida. I mean, there's a lot of really good environmental organizations that are out there. But what you can really do to make a difference, because we have ideologues that are controlling the political parties. And many of you might be involved with wonderful organizations like CODI, but unless you get involved and engaged in the political structure, whether it's a local Republican Party, a local Democratic Party, that's where they're starting to exercise their clout. In so doing, you probably read the other day, Terry Miller, the president, chairman of the local Lee County Republican Party, who's a consultant for several candidates, actually has been able to get the local Republican Party to endorse candidates prior to the primary. And of course that breaks Ronald Reagan's 11th commandment, thou shalt not speak ill of your fellow Republican. But whether you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, or Green Party, whatever, it's important that you get engaged politically, because there is such a disconnect between those that are controlling who ends up getting elected to office and those that are fighting so hard and so valiantly to provide responsible stewardship of our resources. And then, of course, feel free, which is important, for contributions to the Sambo Captiva Conservation Foundation, to Cody, which of course is not, and you are of course supporting Cody, a 501c3 tax-exempt organization. And I'm not ashamed to suggest to you that if you feel that I'm the appropriate person, along with Rand, to represent your interests and fight the polluters and be engaged, our Florida Coastal and Ocean Coalition also needs funding to keep me active and keep me working throughout the state. So if any of you are interested in helping to contribute to the Florida Coastal and Ocean Coalition, obviously I'd be deeply grateful, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here actually to try to get the information to you, as I do with all other organizations throughout the state. Having said that, we'll open it up to questions that you may have. Okay, well, you have a good day. No, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
My question is, with the nitrates and phosphates that are going down the lake, is the Everglades able to filter that out properly, or is it just going to be dumped down by the Keys?
No, if what you're getting at is if we restore or rechannel that water from the lake to the Everglades, I think you were suggesting perhaps that might be a problem with all the nutrients affecting the Everglades.
Yeah, does that filter out?
It has to. We're going to have to comply, and I would never compromise the Everglades to protect our estuaries. All of our ecosystems need to be protected. So the idea is that with the flowway, it was be dynamically designed as such that there would be enough storage and treatment to address the filtration of those nutrients before it's conveyed to the south.
Okay. Thank you.
Larry, could you just speak loudly, Larry?
I'll
I know
try.
you can do it.
Ray, it sounds like what you were saying is the only real solution for us is a flowway to the south. I also know that several years ago, U.S. Sugar agreed to sell more than 50,000 acres. We didn't take them up on it. But what I don't understand is, if U.S. Sugar was willing to sell enough land to create a flowway to the south, what is the impediment now to do it? 50,000 acres does not sound like a whole lot of acres to acquire. What is the major impediment now to this silver bullet, which sounds to me like it would fix the problem?
The sugar industry. At one point in time, when the economy was suffering, they were amenable to selling the entire 187,000 acres. They are not amenable today. It's amazing to me. You've got the sugar industry economic impact in the state of Florida at $4.5 billion, and you have the tourism industry that's predicated on clean water at $65 billion. But it's not the tourists that contribute to the politicians, it's the sugar industry. And so therein lies the problem. The impediment is the politicians that are in the legislature and the governor are not interested in upsetting the sugar industry and pushing for the purchase of the land to create the flowway. I think the sugar industry generally feels that it's too great an encroachment into their operations. And I think I've tried to demonstrate to all of you today with the numbers that it's not. If we can just get people to the table to try to provide that balanced approach that we need. Yes, sir.
Let me bring you the microphone, too.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Let me add.
Sure.
I think I can project myself well enough. Oh, you got one back here. Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. If the land actually were purchased for the flowway, approximately how long do you think it would take to actually build something like that?
That depends on the will of those in charge. I would submit that with funding potentially from the BP oil spill, which is in the billions to the state of Florida, and the prioritization of purchase of land with some of that BP money, or the restructuring of the South Florida Water Management District's capital improvement program so that they would put some projects on the back burner for a while and reprioritize the purchase of the land and the construction of the flowway as their priority, or bond financing? Because during the Crist administration, they validated the bond financing to buy that land to begin with. Those are three approaches right there where there's sufficient funds to go ahead and purchase the land and build the reservoir if it would be the will of those that are in charge.
How long would the actual construction of the,
It would depend on how you would design and construct the flowway. It could be a combination of sinuous wetland marsh system, which is like what Mother Nature had initially, combined with perhaps some shallow water reservoirs, anywhere from 5 to 10 feet in depth, to have the necessary ability to store and treat and convey to the south. How long that would take, I couldn't tell you. I'm not an engineer, and certainly there's permits and the funding issue that I need to tell you about, but I would think we should have a governor that declare a declaration of emergency and make this the highest priority that they could do and get this thing built. But right now, there's just no will. I wish I could give you a figure, but I can't. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry, right over here, and then I'll get to you, sir.
You know, in order to influence people, you have to hit them where it hurts. And there is an opportunity, I wonder if it's ever been considered, to organize a national boycott of sugar. Has that ever been considered? Has that ever been discussed?
It has. I think people have too much of a love affair with sugar.
Well, you know, we have the obesity problem.
We do.
That the president's talking about, and the First Lady. It seems to be a natural connection there.
There is, and I like your thinking, but unfortunately, people end up giving way to their own urgent needs.
Well, it's in so many products.
Oh,
Hard to,
yeah.
it would be hard to boycott anyway.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Okay, I don't think I need a microphone. I think I can help. Oh, okay. Well, my question is, what is the difference between C-43 and C-44? Why did one of them provide for a water clearance and the other one didn't when they were both built about the same time?
Well, you know, that's a really good question, because it amazes me when I've been over in the East Coast, in the Indian River Lagoon area, talking to the Rivers Coalition and other groups, they will have literally thousands of people at their events. This is about as big as an event that I have seen with all my, other than one time out in Captiva with the speaking engagements. For some reason, the people here on the West Coast don't seem to fully understand the severity of the problem, particularly the business community, whether they're real estate or affected by you know, through the tourism industry. So that's one issue. The other is that Martin County contributed, I think it was about $40 million. Towards the purchase of the land and ultimate construction of the C-44 reservoir. And they insisted that a water quality or a water treatment filtration system be built. In fact, there's a 6,000-acre marsh that's being built to provide water quality. Over here, I know Rayanne and myself impressed upon the South Florida Water Management District at the time that they first started thinking about purchasing and building the C-44 reservoir, that in this Chiefs report and in their initial design, the Chiefs report to be signed by the Corps of Engineers, that they didn't have a water quality treatment system in place. And what they told me, there's something called a project implementation report, that in phase 2 of this project implementation report, they would reconsider perhaps funding a water treatment facility. Well, that's much too late. And so it's unfortunate that here we are going to have a storage and no water quality treatment. So I would put the response in a nutshell: there was greater interest and push by the folks on the East Coast.
Ray, this gentleman's been waiting here.
Thank you, Barbara.
I'm wondering if instead of making the spillway go straight through the sugarcane field, could you make a spillway that would go around the cane fields to the east and connect down south to go down to the Everglades?
The reason it's being proposed or is contemplated directly south, first of all, it wouldn't impact South Bay, which is that one community there around the lake that there's been some suggestion that we might end up having displaced residents there, is that it's right in line just south where I just showed you on the slides. I think if you go further to the east, you may run into problems of actually taking out homes or taking out infrastructure. So we really haven't even gotten to that point in the discussion as to where this flowway would actually be aligned. I certainly would be open, and so would everybody else that's pushing for this flowway, to consider any alignment. Just get the water south. But some land in the sugarcane fields and in the Everglades agriculture will have to be purchased and set aside as a flowway. But as I said, it's a minimal amount. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it seems to me like the root of the problem is really those federal helps to the sugar industry, like the tariffs and the quotas. And if we did away with those, I mean, it seems like the problem would go away and the sugar industry would almost give the land away because producing sugar wouldn't be economical. It would be produced in Jamaica or elsewhere. So my question to you is, the Farm Bill apparently comes from the U.S. Senate. What is the position of the Florida senators with respect to this Farm Bill?
They have supported the continued protectionist scheme for the sugar industry in the Farm Bill. And I say that with all due respect to Senator Bill Nelson, who has really valiantly tried to work with both the east and west coast of South Florida to address the restoration of the Everglades. He has been a true champion. But politically, perhaps, he thought perhaps it was too unpalatable. And unfortunately, that seems to be the case with most everybody else in Congress. But that's the Achilles heel. You reform the Farm Bill, and you start to have a free market economy, and I think that'll take care of itself.
Thanks. We're running out of time for questions, but I believe Ray is going to stay around for a few minutes during our break.